Happy Sabbath and welcome back, everyone. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the Sabbath. Thank you that we can come back and continue to study with you. I pray that the Holy Spirit may be with us again and that we may learn something from today's study, myself included. I praise you and I pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Right. Does anybody have any questions, or are you
Wait,
going to ask
sorry.
when you're ready, Curtis?
I'm going to do a different topic and then
Right.
question and
Then the
answer.
questions afterwards. Okay,
Yeah.
over to you then.
Okay. So I had asked earlier in the week, yet again, to watch studies that I did last week. And those studies were the first of those studies was exploring how we use time as a symbol. Um, and we've become acquainted with using the 126 with that symbology, where we go back from a waymark in our history into the past, and it connects two histories, and we can compare and contrast those histories. And so, um, when you do that with each of our Sunday laws, with each of the Sunday law waymarks, the line of the priests, Levites, Nethinims, and then on the line of the 144K, it takes you to specific years in history where significant events happened. Um, and so, just as a quick refresher, from 1989, we come to 1863. From 2014, using the 1 to 6, it takes you to 2018. 2019 takes you to 1863. And so those were the ones that had been done. I'm not sure if Aldates ever did a study on 2021 taking you to 1895, but it does. And there's a history that takes place in 1895 as well, that can be associated with a Sunday law. And in those studies I did last week, I suggested that 2024 as well can take you using the 126, takes you to 1898. And so this story that you have with all these waymarks, these Sunday laws, I include 1989 because it's the time of the end, and it leads you to successive Sunday laws. The time of the end is when you have a message about a Sunday law coming, um, and so that's why I include it in these lines. We have them as separate waymarks in our fractals, but if you think of it as a story of Sunday laws, they run on the same line. And so, just as a recap, in 1863, we have the Civil War going on, but it's out of the Civil War that you have the foundations for a unified United States coming because the Union is preserved. Um, so, you have a nation unified. This is the midpoint of that Civil War, unified. But out of it, you have a nation united. In 1888, however, um, which we would line up with 2014, you have, as discussed a lot by Aldates in that document, how the Constitution became Christian or something like that. She discusses how 1888 fits into that history about a culture war with regards to America trying to shape its identity. And so you have religious identity um, being the first thing that, or at least the first Sunday law that we can identify as being identity, the core issue after the time of the end. And then from there you get to 1893. And in 1893, Aldates ties the Chicago World Fair to 2019. And the debates around the Chicago World Fair were with regards to a Sunday law. Should they keep the fair open or closed on Sunday, etc., etc. But this Chicago World Fair was there was more controversy surrounding the Chicago World Fair than just the Sunday law issue. When you look at what the Chicago World Fair was, it was in memoriam of um, Columbian history when Columbia set sail, landed, discovered America. So it was really an event to showcase American exceptionalism, if you want to call it that, with the different inventions that America had, with the different things that could be celebrated in America. So it was a place to show American greatness. It was an event that was made to show American greatness within its architecture, etc. And there were other controversies associated with the Chicago World Fair in this year because while the fair promoted American greatness, it exposed religious and not religious, sorry, racial and social tensions that were going on in America because African Americans were largely excluded from this fair, the Chicago World Fair, and there were protests. So that's here, and in that same year you have um, the Panic of 1893. There was an economic crisis that takes place in up until that point, it was the worst economic crisis in U.S. history, and it triggered the collapse of railroads, bank failures, depletion of gold reserves. So there were economic woes. Just reminding us that in 2019, that's when the COVID, we can mark COVID, and at least in our recent history, it's one of the most significant economic crises that we've had. You could argue 2008, 2009 was bigger, but the point is that that takes place in 1893, and then in 1895, um, America had primarily been a country that was more focused on its internal issues. Um, but in the early 1800s, there was what was called the Monroe Doctrine, which was essentially that if states come into our spheres of influence, South America, North America, we're going to intervene and kick you out. Um, Very high level summary. But they had never invoked this. And then in 1895, they invoke the Monroe Doctrine in the Venezuelan crisis. Venezuelan crisis. So America is starting to shift its approach to world events. It was it was really this isolated country, and then it turns in this turning point of a year to start now getting involved in world affairs, which they hadn't done in a large degree before that. This Monroe Doctrine was signed in 1823 to pressure British arbitration, etc., etc. But this in 1895, it was invoked to in this dispute between Venezuela and Britain over certain territory in South America. But what all I want to point out is that in 1895 you have another turning point, which is going to foreshadow its role in as being a superpower because it's a shift in its foreign policy. Um, and then finally you get to 1898, and I discussed 1898 in detail a fair bit of detail last week. That was the Spanish American War and the imperial expansionism that took place after the Spanish American War. And you can see this thread, Spanish American War. You can see a thread between all of this where from 1863 through each step of these turning points, it's getting to a point where now America is going to flex its muscles on the globe stage from being a relatively, I'm going to say, introverted nation, just dealing with domestic issues, to now stepping onto the world stage. And I speak about how this was, most historians mark 1898 as the year where America changed. It changed its foreign policy. It was a defining year because now it's going to become a superpower. So I ran through that fairly quickly, but I wanted to set this structure, this idea of successive Sunday laws leading up to the culmination of something. In this case, it was the culmination of 1898 and Americans' change in in foreign policy. When we consider the rise and fall of empires, our primary focus is on the king of the north. And so when the Midnight Cry was given, up until that point, we had spent quite a bit of detail understanding and exploring the king of the north because of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. Elder Test comes along and our focus is expanded because now we start exploring the king of the south and the fact that it's not just done and dusted in 1989. There's a story between 1989 and the Sunday Law with regards to the king of the south, and she starts comparing and contrasting. But ultimately, this story in verse 40 to 45 is a story about the king of the north. The king of the south is just a step along the way for the king of the north until it gets into the glorious land in verse 41, and then goes on to conquer the world, represented by Egypt in the successive verses. Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45's primary focus is the king of the north. Uh, and so there's 2 points when we read Daniel 11, whoops, verse 40, 41, and verse 45. And verse 41 essentially says that the king of the north, America, is going to go into the glorious land, America, um, and many are going to be overthrown, but some are going to escape. So the key point that I want to see here is that the king of the north is going to go into the glorious land. That's point one, after defeating the king of the south, etc., etc. And then the second point is in verse 45, because these are going to be the bedrock of the study that we're going to do now, is that in verse 45 it says that after the king of the north plants its palace, its seat of governance between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, it's going to come to its end, and none are going to help it. So in verse 45, they eventually come to the end, and none help, and nobody helps it. So in this story that we discussed here, you can you see a pattern or a story about the rise of America to becoming a global superpower. And it's birthed, well, this story starts in the midpoint of a civil war. That civil war is 1861 to 1865, but in the midpoint of that civil war, the Union really, as in the North, really take grip of that war. So I'm saying that it's from 1863, really, that the story begins of a United Nation going on to becoming a superpower. There's a quote from, it's a significantly reputable source, I think, that I want to read. Um, I'll post it in the chat. I'm sure you're all familiar with this author or this source. I'll read the quote first. A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within. And that source is obviously the Media Broadcast Group. um, the original authors were, their names were Will and Ariel, I think that's how you pronounce it, Durant. They were co-authors of this book where this quote is taken from. But the point that this is making is that there's a conquering within before there's a conquering without. So that's the idea of a civil war, is that there's a war that takes place internally. When we think of the Alpha and Omega, what's the sign for Omega? Alpha and Omega, there's a structure that we get from that to help us with our Bible study. It's not just that God is at the beginning and the end in a progressive story. It's that you can compare and contrast this Alpha and this Omega to help you learn stuff. So at our Omega, at the end, the King of the North is the USA. I'm just going to say that as a matter of fact. And then at our Alpha, the Alpha King of the North that we're familiar with, at least, that starts the story in Daniel 2, is Babylon. So I thought um, it would be interesting to understand the rise of Babylon in as the Alpha King of the North, and what we can learn about this Babylon's rise and fall, and see what it can teach us about the USA's rise and fall as the King of the North. Um, in the story of Acts 27, when Paul becomes the leader of that ship, when he is now commanding the Roman officers, and they get to the Isle of Malta, that ship that Paul is now in charge of, it's not a mistake that they crash. It's not, sure, that ship shouldn't even have gone on that path. Paul had warned them. But now, given the circumstances, Paul is going to say, we need to shipwreck. It's the only way that we are going to survive. And so, shipwreck, that ship is shipwrecked on purpose to save everyone, given the course that they had taken. It's the best thing that Paul could do, given circumstances. And so when we think of captivity, again, the Israelite captivity and etc., the Israelites went down a path that damaged them, that they shouldn't have gone down. And what's God going to do to save them? God's going to bring the King of the North to save them. And it's that captivity that ultimately saves the Israelites, if you can put it that way, from themselves. When I first joined the movement, we studied Daniel and Revelation quite thoroughly. And at the time, I must have been, I don't know, 13, 14, and I just enjoyed tagging along with my family to these Bible studies that were done by Elder Tabo, uh, about the charts and Daniel and Revelation. I just found it interesting. Probably because the pictures looked cool, but in those studies, as a young boy, I picked up on various themes. And in studying those books of Daniel and Revelation, there was one that I recalled the other day, that in fact the person who taught it to me is with us, blessing, taught this idea of, if I can say your name, taught this idea of two desolating powers. And it was really the first time I had come in contact or come to learn about any of that. When you read Daniel 9, verse 26 and 27, or Daniel 8 and 11 and 12, you see this reoccurring pattern, or this story about two desolations, two desolating powers. And we see this illustrated in the 2520, where that 2520 is going to be split into two different periods, into two 1260s, pagan Rome and papal Rome, who are going to be these two desolating powers, uh, desolating God's people. But I want to consider not the desolating powers, but I want to consider the the actions that these desolating powers do. So what those desolations look like. And so if you go into the study of two different desolating periods, there's a distinct there are distinct characteristics associated with those desolations. The first one is that this first desolation is going to be some sort of physical subjugation of God's people because of their national rebellion against God's covenant, and it's going to be corrective. There's still opportunity for them to repent, but under that time period of the first desolation, there's military oppression, there's subjection, etc., and a foreign power comes in. You see this with regards to Assyria. Assyria comes in 722 and starts this time period, and the Israelites are going to be desolated 722 and 677, if I have those dates correct. Um, and that's stage one. So if I can draw it like this, you have Syria in stage one. Another example where we see this taking place is from 34 AD. There's going to be persecution up until 70 AD under the Roman Empire. But the two phases of that persecution were significantly different because from 34 AD to 70 AD, the Jews had been scattered. They'd been persecuted, but their temple still stood. Their religious homes still remained intact. And then from 70 AD, um, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. And that brings us to the second desolation, where now we're going to have papal Rome. Assyria, I'm just putting that as pagan Rome. Um, in the second period, papal Rome's going to come in, and that purpose is more severe because now probation has closed, and it's not only dealing with political destruction, it's now dealing with spiritual corruption and oppression for God's people. And it's the final judgment after they've rejected God. And there's now a spiritual fleeing or taking away, if you want to call it that. And so, in the Dark Ages, this papacy is going to suppress the truth for these 1260 years. It's no longer political in the same way it was with Assyria, it's now spiritual. After 70 AD, the temple is destroyed. Jesus had warned them that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed because of their rejection of the Messiah, and this is the final scattering for the Jews. Um, so there's these two phases. Phase one is a political and military chastisement, and phase two is this final spiritual judgment where the chance to return to God has been rejected, and it's now a second stage in that desolation that's going to take place. The window is still opened. So I go through that because that exists at a high level. So when you have Assyria and then you have or pagan Rome and then you have papal Rome. But I think we can see the same pattern at fractal levels. The one fractal level that I spoke of was this one, um, of 34 AD to 70 AD, and then from 70 AD onwards. At this point, the temple is destroyed, and then at this point in 538, the truth is suppressed, etc. Interchangeable terms that I'm using. Um, but there's another place where I suggest you see the same dynamic, and that's when we think about Babylon and Israel. So the captivity of Judah by Babylon. It's one desolating power, Babylon all the way through, but it does so in two different phases, in two different sequences. Phase one and then phase two. Now, I'd like to give a disclaimer before we get into this, is that I am not a chronologist, and when you read through Ellen White's writings or the pioneers' work, often the dates that you find them reference are not going to be the dates that secular chronologists are going to use today. So one example of that is the Battle of Carchemish, for instance. Um, Historians are going to put the Battle of Carchemish at 605 BC, but pioneers are going to put that Battle of Carchemish in 606 BC. And this becomes important when as you'll see later down the road, when thinking about where we're going to place stuff. My point is, I'm not here to say it definitely happened in 606 or it should happen in 605. I'm more interested in seeing the concurrent events that take place in a specific year. So it's that I would defend a bit more than the year that you're going to play stuff. Um, but this Battle of Carchemish that we have in 606, Jeremiah references it in Jeremiah 46 verse 2, because now Jeremiah, after talking about the judgment that God is going to place on the Israelites, is going to talk about the other surrounding nations. And it's this message against Pharaoh, who was Necho at the time. And it talks about how Carchemish is destroyed on the river Euphrates by Nebuchadnezzar, who was king at that time, who had taken over. It says king of Babylon, but I'm not sure if Nebuchadnezzar had been made king before that battle. I don't think so. I think he was a general at that battle, and then after that, his father dies or something, and Nebuchadnezzar is made king. But this takes place in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah. So I just want to point out that this is taken from the Bible, and so it's in the fourth year of Jehoiakim. So here we have the fourth year of Jehoiakim, and it's Jeremiah who's writing this. Jeremiah at the time was living in Judah. He hadn't been taken captive yet. No, he hadn't been taken captive. I don't think at any point he gets taken captive, Jehoiakim. The fourth year of Jehoiakim. In Daniel 1, verse 1, Daniel is writing and speaking about the captivity of the Israelites by Babylon. And Daniel says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So now Daniel is going to say, in the third year, Nebuchadnezzar came and took the Israelites captive. So we have two different authors who have two different years for different events, the Battle of Carchemish and the Israelite captivity. However, these two events happened in the same year. So after Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt and the remaining Assyrians at Carchemish, he went on to take that first lot of Israelites captive. So you'll ask the question, why does Daniel say the third year and why does Jeremiah say the fourth year? The reason why there's this apparent discrepancy is because Jeremiah, still living in Judah, never took on Babylonian customs. So how the Israelites are going to count the years of kings is they're going to use what are called non-ascension years. It's a system of counting when a king begins to reign, and that king begins to reign in the first year, even if only a partial year. So, for example, if Jehoiakim began his reign in the middle of the year, that year was still considered his first year. Whereas Daniel, living in Babylon, is going to use an ascension year system where the first full calendar year of a king's reign is going to be counted as their first year. So in that example, if Jehoiakim begins reigning in the middle of the year, that year was called his ascension year, and the following year was counted as his first year. So these events, the points that I want to make is that these events happened in the same year. Um, Nebuchadnezzar defeats Pharaoh and then later goes on to Judah and besieges Jerusalem and takes the first wave of captives, including Daniel, into captivity. And then in 586, um, Nebuchadnezzar is going to come again. And you read this in 2 Kings 25, verse 8 to 10. I'm not going to read any of the Bible verses that we speak about unless there's something specific phrasing that I want because of time. But you can read it. So that's 2 Kings 25, verse 8 to 10. In there, it talks about how Nebuchadnezzar is going to come and is going to burn down Jerusalem. Now it's going to be flattened, completely destroyed, and the temple is going to be destroyed. And this is the temple where um, religious worship was associated, and etc. So I bring this up to refer back to these two phases of desolation that we spoke of. One is more political, there's still probation opened, and the next is the spiritual captivity, because after 586, everything was pretty much in ruins. There were a few people left in Judah that remained. You hear about what Jeremiah did after his ministry, buying a piece of land, etc., etc. But there are these two different phases of desolation, phase one and phase two. And I'm suggesting that 586 lines up with the close of probation because the temple is destroyed, and we line up 70 AD with the close of probation where the temple is destroyed as well. So we have two phases of desolation. Um, but I wanted to give us this framework so that the rest of our story has can have a bit more integrity with regards to where we're leading to. If it wasn't clear, I'm marking Carchemish was 606 this year as the Sunday law because that is when you have this first phase of desolation, when the Israelites are taken captive, where the king of the north, the now king of the north, Nebuchadnezzar, is going to go into the glorious land for the first time. Before that, it was Assyria that was pretty much, not Assyria, sorry, Egypt. No, Assyria. It was Assyria that was um, involved in Judah, and the north had fallen years before that, many years before that. Um, and so we have this framework: Sunday law, Carchemish, close of probation, 586 when Jerusalem is destroyed. Again, a disclaimer that where pioneers or Ellen White don't give a year for a specific event happening, I've just gone with historians. And I recognize the dangers in doing that, in mixing two different. But as I said, it's not necessarily the specific year that I'm trying to emphasize as opposed to the concurrent events. So, yeah, the concurrent event at the Battle of Carchemish is that the battle takes place in this year, and in that same year, Nebuchadnezzar comes and goes into the glorious land to mark captivity, and that's the license that I'm giving to put Carchemish at the Sunday law. Now, in different studies, you could put Carchemish at the close of probation, depending on what story that you're going to tell. Um, as I said in a previous presentation, where every symbol or every waymark must have its proper bearing, and who determines that is it's the painter, it's the person giving the study. So now that we have this framework, I want to think about what was taking place before the Battle of Carchemish, leading up to this point. In Daniel, we have several visions that trace down the sequence of nations that make up God's kingdom, that God is going to use to punish God's people, or if I can say, reform God's people. And Daniel starts this prophetic delineation with Babylon. But Daniel is writing this when he's in Babylon, when he's under the stewardship of Nebuchadnezzar. But before Babylon, Assyria was the kingdom that ruled and is the kingdom that punished, in inverted commas, God's people. So, for all intents and purposes, Assyria, in its own right, could be and can be, I think you could make that argument pretty strongly, that Assyria can also be identified as the king of the north. Daniel just doesn't mention them because he's writing after the fact and he's telling a specific perspective. So prior to Daniel telling that, Babylon at the time was a small town that was under Assyrian control. Assyria was the establishment, it was the established kingdom um, in that piece of history. In Habakkuk, um, Habakkuk is going to have this debate with God, and there's a prophecy that's going to come out of that. And God is going to tell Habakkuk that it may not seem like it, but I'm going to raise up this small nobody of a people to come and punish Judah. And who that was in reference to was Babylon, because Babylon were nobodies really. But they're going to rise up, defeat the Assyrians, and establish their own empire. And throughout the book of Jeremiah, you have references to Babylon and its rise and the judgment that is going to be used by God with Babylon against Judah. You can read through Jeremiah 25 to read that, but essentially that's what Jeremiah's ministry was. It was this warning that Babylon is coming and you better get your act together. So we have the Battle of Carchemish in 606, where the Babylonian army is led by Nebuchadnezzar to defeat Egypt and the remnants of the Assyrian forces. As I said, historians are going to say 605. Some of the pioneers are going to say 606. I'll point out why I've gone with the pioneers a bit later. Some of the pioneers. a bit later. But in this battle of Carchemish, I'm telling you the end of the story, and then we'll go to the beginning. At this battle of Carchemish, the Assyrians are pretty much done and dusted. They're on their last legs. It's just a remnant. But Egypt come in. Um, Egypt come in to try and save those remnants because they have their own agenda. They're worried about this rising nation, Babylon, and they come in to try and save Assyria in this alliance, but ultimately they fail. In Daniel 2, in the story of Daniel 2, verse 44, Daniel says that in the days of these kings, God is going to set up a kingdom. So that's talking about at the end of the world. That and these kings, Elder Paminda has made the point, and I agree with him, that these kings that Daniel is referring is to the kings that come before, that come before this point. So it's not just the kings in the toes and the feet. It's all the kings because when describing the final fall of the statue, um, it's the essence of all these kings of the north that can be found in the last king of the north. So just like how we mark Julius Caesar at the end or Alexander the Great at the end, um, what we're doing is we're identifying the kings mostly associated with that kingdom and typifying them at the end. And so this can be said of Nebuchadnezzar as well, being the first king in Daniel's story. You can see him at the end. So Nebuchadnezzar at the beginning, it starts with Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel's story, and it ends with Nebuchadnezzar. What I'm saying is a type of Trump. So Nebuchadnezzar at the end as well. Nebuchadnezzar begins his reign here at 606, and he's the king that essentially brings the golden image, brings the Sunday law. We've um, looked at Daniel 3 in the context of a Sunday law since time forever. But that's the king that brings the Sunday law. So Trump being the king that brings the Sunday law. Um, but that's not our study. Well, at least it's a part of our study. That's the end of our study. But I want to speak about everything that led up to this point, to Babylon being established at the Sunday law with Nebuchadnezzar as the king, the new king of the north, because the title king of the north is really in relation to God's people. And you can go through the geography of that and the symbology of that. But the title of king of the north is it's really a title because of the relationship to God's people, and the captivity that they bring to God's people. But to get to this point, Babylon had to rise. Babylon had to go through a transformation of its own. And this transformation was spurred on through a civil war. Remember, Babylon was, I've drawn a little map here. Babylon was this small little town, and everything in red is the Assyrian kingdom. It's the kingdom of Assyria. You'll find different maps. I don't even know if this is the correct one, but it just gives you a high level overview of where the Assyrian kingdom spanned. And Babylon was just this province under Assyrian's kingdom. And so just as we spoke about how a new nation, the USA, it's not new, but with regards to its rise to a superpower was birthed through civil war, the king of the north, Babylon, is also born through civil war. So it has to take over the incumbent, the establishment, first before it can become the new de facto king of the north. So we're going to go through this history from when this fight kicks off, leading up to what I'm saying is the Sunday law. For a bit of context, Assyria had been ruling for ages, and they had amassed so much that it now became difficult to manage. The empire was just too big, and governing it effectively became a strain. And often throughout the ages, different provinces would rebel, but they pretty much squashed those rebellions successfully. Um, until the last strong king, strong man, if you want to put it that, dies. His name was Ashur Banipal. Um, I'll just write it because I know I'm not pronouncing it right. Ashur Banipal. He was the last great leader of Assyria, effective leader, and he dies in 631. Um, Different sources will say different things, but generally the sources say 631. He dies in that year. And then in 627, um, his son had taken control in 631, but his son, Asher Etel Lani, so uh, I'll type it down, Asher Etel um, Ilani, takes the kingdom, but he was a young boy when he took reins, and there was another person who was the head of the army. His name was oh no, we'll get to that. But essentially he's going to take over and he's going to die in 627. And his death sends sends Assyria into chaos because there's going to be warring factions with regards to who's going to be king, and there's going to be this whole argument of who should be the rightful king. I said I wouldn't read, but I will read this. Um, Quoting from a book called Assyria. I can't remember the name of the author, but it says in 627, Asher Etel Lani disappeared from the scene. Since he was very young at this point, he was possibly murdered. So people don't really know what happened to him, but the likelihood is that he was murdered. But even before Asher Etel Ilani's demise, remember he was the son of Asher Banipal. Um, there was another son whose name was Sin Sharu Ishkun, and he had sought to win the Assyrian throne for himself. Now, with his brother out of the way, he found his position substantially strengthened. But he wasn't the only contender. In a highly unusual move, a third player steps in. Um, so we've got Asher Etal Lani as King 1, um, and then King 2, who's going to take over after this person dies, is Sin Sharu Ishkun. But when he takes over, there was another guy whose name was, I don't know why I chose this story with all these difficult names, but there was another guy called Sin Shumu Lishir. He was the chief eunuch, and he claimed kingship over Syria as well, because during the reign of Ashur Etel Ilani, who was this small boy, he fought the different enemies who were trying to fight this young boy, and he consolidated the rulership for this young boy. And so he felt that I should really be the one who takes over this. I've done the work. I've been the most loyal servant for this heritage, for this lineage. And he had different motivations, but he fights for that role. And he was a eunuch. Now, the author then goes on to explain that um, his claim over Syria, so Lishir's claim over Syria, was unusual, being the chief eunuch. Eunuchs, biologically unable to sustain a dynastic line, had never served as king in Assyria before. They were supposed to support the king, not hold his office. There can be little doubt, therefore, um, that when this guy Sin Shumu Lishi is trying to get the throne for himself, it triggers a major crisis of legitimacy for the Assyrian crown. Um, he Different sources will say different things, but I think generally they say that he made his claim for the throne in the following year, in 626. 626. BC. And so you have two kings at this in 627. Oh no, I shouldn't have done that. Let me just do this. You have two kings in 627, legitimate kings, Asha Etal Ilani, and then when he dies, Sin Shuru Ishkun. Um, they have rightful claims to the throne, and you have this person who's an imposter who tries to claim the throne in 626, being a eunuch, and um, who's challenging for this throne. In the same year, talking about 627, Jeremiah is called to ministry. So in Jeremiah 1, verse 2 and 3, it talks about how the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah in the days of Josiah in the 13th year of his reign. If you look back at when the 13th year of his reign was, it was in 627. Um, and Ellen White points out in Patriarch and Prophets and Kings, page 408. So Prophets and Kings, page 408. Um, his ministry lasted for 40 years. So just quoting Ellen White, for 40 years, Jeremiah was to stand before the nation as a witness for truth and righteousness. Now, you're going to ask yourself, so here's Jeremiah 627, and he pretty much stopped his ministry in 586. He continues talking afterwards, but this probationary time that the Israelites had came to its conclusion in 586 when Jerusalem was destroyed. So there's his 40 years ministry, which is a symbol of probation. You're going to point out something quite obvious that 627 doesn't take you to 586. That's 41 years. But when you look at the kings after Josiah and you count the 13th year from Josiah and you keep counting until the final king, when Jeremiah finishes his ministry. In verse 3, it tells you that he finished his ministry unto the 11th year of Zedekiah. So if you count the successive kings from Josiah to Zedekiah, um, it's 40 years. The reason why it looks like it's 41 is because Jeremiah doesn't start his ministry at the beginning of the year in 627. It's at some point in the middle of the year. And then it was 40 years and like 5 months or something. And so his 40 years goes here. So that's just to my understanding of this um, dilemma, if you will, if you're going to call out that there is a discrepancy. So for argument's sake, let's just say that this is 40 years from 627 to 586. Historical and biblical chronology is complicated, so you need to be careful with how you count and where things start. Is it in the middle of the year? Is it at the beginning of the year? And you can become confused quite easily. I'm not a chronologist, so um, yeah, I'm also open to critique. But anyway, so you have a message warning about a coming king of the north. Jeremiah's ministry starts here in 627. And I am associating this year with the time of the end, given two things. One, you have two kings. We place two presidents or two kings at the time of the end with Reagan and Bush, or if we want to do the line of Babylon separately, you have two kings, Darius, Cyrus, and various other studies where you can place two kings at the start. And Elder Tess uses that same logic in Acts 27 to mark the two kings that are going to get the message from Paul. So you have two kings and you have probationary period opening, Jeremiah's ministry starting. So 40 years. And so that's why I associate that with the time of the end. So you have these two kings and now Assyria is unstable. And you have a revolt taking place in 626. Now, Babylon were a pretty proud people. the people of Babylon. They held on to cultural and religious identity very strongly, and it fueled their resentment towards the establishment Assyria, because Assyria kept trying to impose their belief system onto the different tribes and the different nations that they held under them, but Babylon held on to their own unique identity. The Babylons were devoted to the god called Marduk, and Assyria had a god called Ashur. Um, And so this created friction. There were other reasons why Babylon wanted to separate from Assyria, but this was a big part of it. This culture war, if you want to call it, between the two nations. In 626, the person who was overlord, if you want to call it, over that Assyria put over Babylon dies, and now everything's just in a panic. Assyria is crumbling, and someone stands up, a charismatic leader, Nebuchadnezzar, um, and he prompts a revolution, a revolt, and it starts in 626. And that was the defining moment for Babylon as they broke away from Assyria to start this Neo-Babylonian empire. He seized control of Babylon from the Assyrians, and he consolidates power as he goes to the different local tribes, um, etc. And this is what really started the fall of Assyria as being the dominant power, the establishment to Babylon rising up and taking over the mantle. Reading from this same book that I've mentioned called Assyria, talking about 626, the author says one of the first victims of Nebuchadnezzar's wrath after consolidating his power would be this Sinshumu Elishi. The Nebuchadnezzar epic, which is where historians get their data from or their information from, reports that the king encountered this eunuch, um, presumably this guy, on the roof of a palace near Babylon, where the eunuch at some point late in 626 had attempted to find refuge because he's running away from Sin Sharmu Ishkun, who he's having this fight with regards to who's going to be king. And he cries out, "No, don't kill me, mighty king," to Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar is unmoved by this desperate plea for mercy, and he shouts out, "Let the Assyrian be killed," and so he dies. But what I want to mark out here is that there's a revolution that begins at this waymark. Revolution and eunuch. And what we know about eunuchs is that they're the last generation. So I want to point out that now you have symbology to tie. This is the last generation for Assyria um, that's going to come. You can place this eunuch in 627 and in 626 with regards to the role that he has in politics in Assyria. And now Sin Sharmur Ishkun is going to become the sole holder of the Assyrian throne. They had been this back and forth. When we discuss the lines of revolutions or the line of the counterfeit, um, both studies done by Elder Tess, she associates the revolution that's going to be started by the Republican Party, the Civil War in 2001. So I'm marking the events from this revolt as beginning. Oh, whoops, I put 2012. 2001. So you have this revolution that's going to mark the last generation um, for this empire as taking place. And on the line of the counterfeit as well, she marks the revolution within the Catholic Church as taking place in 2001. So those are the reasons why I'm placing that there. So now, after the revolt that took place that Nebuchadnezzar did in 626, he Goes on for a few more years to try and solidify Babylonians' independence, and the Assyrian forces start getting weaker and weaker. Now, another entity comes in, um, the Medes. The Medes were to the east of Assyria over here, roughly. And they see this as an opportunity to take down Assyria because they held gripes over Assyria as well. And the weakened Assyrian forces opened a door for the Medes to come in. The king, the king of Media at the time, his name was Cyaxares, and he goes and he marches to this city called Assa or Ashur. If you want to look it up in your Bibles, it will be spelled. It will be in different forms, either as Ashur or Assur, however you find it, but it's the same word really. And the Medes, um, they have no long-standing interest in ruling over Assyria. So they go into Assa and they pillage and destroy everything. And the temples and the palaces were burned, the sacred statues and Assyrian symbols were defaced, and much of the population was just massacred. Generally, when you want to take over a nation and you want to rule that nation, you leave things intact because you know that you need the infrastructure for when you're going to lead. But the Medes didn't really have an interest. They were just so fed up with the Assyrians, and so they go in and they bring everything to ruins. Reading from a book, Assyria: The Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire by Eckhart Fram. Um, After he's describing the events after the Medes went in and desolated the city Assa. So um, he says, as the Babylonian Chronicle reports, the Babylonian Chronicle is where historians get pretty much most of their history or facts from with regards to this time period. As the Babylonian Chronicle reports, he, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, and Cyaxares met each other near the city, near Asher, and came to an agreement. The goal of this fateful alliance is not spelled out, but it seemed obvious. Together, the two kings wanted to seize the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, and sounded the death knell on the Assyrian Empire. So at this point, you have an alliance um, between the Medes and um, Babylon to take down Assyria. Commenting on the significance of Asher and why this was important, why this was really the first city to fall. Um, there had been squabbles before that between 626 and the fall of Asher, which was in, I didn't put the year there, sorry. It was in 614 BC, is because, now quoting from the same author, the loss of Asher was a disaster for Assyria, not so much because of its military and strategic implications, even though those were significant as well, but for ideological reasons. Since time immemorial, Asher had been the religious heart of the kingdom, the seat of the Assyrian state god Asher. We spoke about Asher earlier when talking about Marduk, and the place where Assyrian kings were crowned and buried. Now, both the Asher temple and the royal tombs were laid to ruins, and the bones of Assyria's great kings were scattered throughout the city. It must have been a fatal blow for the morale of Assyria's elites and military forces, who had lost their main source of spiritual energy. So this was a cultural victory, and it's the Medes that bring this cultural victory, and it's the first significant um, defeat, if you will, in this battle. So I'm pointing out that there's an alliance at this point, and it's an alliance between the Medes plus Babylon. And it's a cultural center that's brought to ruins. I know I'm going through all of this material at hyperspeed, and I apologize. It's just due to lack of time, and I only have one slot to do this. Um, but it can be repeated and enlarged at another point. I just want to get all the information down. But basically, um, this event or this battle, this fall of Asher, if we go back to where is it? If we go back to here, after this event, the first Sunday law that we associate with 2014 is 1888, and that's a culture war. That's an issue with regards to identity. So, for the Medes and the Babylonians, it was expedient for um, Asher to be the first thing that falls, because once you lose your spiritual heartland, your motivation starts sinking a bit further. And in fact, before Nineveh was capital, there were three capitals of Assyria over time, three main capitals. Nineveh, um, Asher was the very first capital, and then after Nineveh fell, um, another city called Haran is where the capital was moved to. But Assyria had significance. That's what I'm pointing out, and it fell at the hands of the Medes. So we have three entities now that we've mentioned. We have Assyria. I'll write it in red. Assyria, who is the establishment. We have the
Wait,
Medes. Yeah,
oh, yeah.
Deborah. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
it's okay.
Okay. We have Assyria, the Medes, and we have Babylon. Assyria being the establishment. So I'm going to put this 614 and line that up with 2014, and I'll tell you why. Um, I'm going to give you a bit of information about who the Medes were. So looking at the natural so that we can make application of the spiritual. In Jeremiah 25, verse 25, when describing the judgment that's going to come to the surrounding nations around Israel, Jeremiah describes the Medes like this. And all the kings of Zimri, and all the kings of Elam, and all the kings of the Medes. The point here is that the Medes had a government where there were several kings as part of this tribal organization. It was a very decentralized system for the time period in which they lived, decentralized. So they were originally a collection of semi-independent tribes which were led by their own chieftain or ruler, and they had their own autonomy before I think it was before Cyaxares comes and unifies the Medes under one one king. But even still, when Cyaxares took place, there was still a level of autonomy amongst the different nations that made up this one bigger nation. Um, and when you look at the Syrian records, there'll be different rulers that are pointed out as falling under the Median kingdom. Um, But the point is that each of these tribes had leadership of their own and social structures of their own, emphasizing this point that Jeremiah is pointing out that there's multiple rulers. Um,
Just
and
let
then
you
they
know.
get, yeah,
Oh, beg your pardon. Just let you know you've got 10 minutes. Are we finishing at 1:15?
Emma, could we have a bit more time?
What do you need, Curtis?
I'll go till 1:30. I won't finish, but at least I'll get to a point where we can finish.
1:30. Is everyone okay with that? Is everyone okay with that? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Um, so even under the Achaemenid Empire, when the Median Kingdom is overthrown by Cyrus, um, they still maintained this decentralized system of governance. And so you read about that in Daniel 6, verse 1. I'm going to read this not in the King James Version because there's a specific word that I want to pick up. It's in another version, but it's essentially the same thing. Um, in speaking about Darius, and how he's going to organize the kingdom, it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. I read it in this version so that you can recognize the word satraps. So when you look it up in the internet, it gives you a bit more context. Um, but essentially, the system of government that Darius the Mede is going to put in place is this idea of local governors in the different provinces, and they're going to have significant autonomy to run things how they want to a degree, but they still have loyalty to the central authority, to the king, to Darius, and the various kings that come after. If you look in secular historians and research Darius the Mede, historians will tell you, or out there, it will say that Darius didn't exist, that he was likely a made up figure and it was a parable in the Bible. So many of the things that Darius did, they're going to attribute them to Cyrus as the first king of this Medo-Persian kingdom. So if you read up who started this idea of satraps, it's going to be Cyrus who did it when you read on Wikipedia. But in Daniel 6 verse 1, it's Darius the Mede because they don't recognize that Darius the Mede existed. So I bring that point that we just need to be careful when we try to reconcile what a prophet says, Daniel in this case, or Ellen White, with what historians say, as every historian is going to poke holes in accounts that are given by prophets, whether it's historical prophets or concurrent ones. But another feature of the Medes, so they have this decentralized government. That's number one. Number two is that the Medes allowed a significant amount, or the Medes allowed cultural and religious diversity during their rule, likely due to the diversity of the people. And this tradition continued under Cyrus, and you find a lot of this detail in what was called the Cyrus cylinder. Cyrus cylinder. And that Cyrus cylinder is again where historians get a lot of the history regarding the fall of Babylon because it was published in what they say was 538, 539. Um, it's really a propaganda piece because Cyrus is going to make it out that he's going to paint things in his favor, obviously, as every writer does. They tell it from their point of view. But the Cyrus cylinder, um, the British Museum, the former director of the British Museum, Neil MacGregor, states that the Cyrus cylinder was the first attempt we know about running a society, a state with different nationalities and faiths, and you get this idea of satraps and etc. etc. But it was Darius the Mede who organized this. But in this cylinder as well, um, the UN, or it's a controverted point, um, but it's regarded as one of the earliest declarations of human rights, where it emphasizes religious intolerance and freedom for conquered people. And we see this particularly in relation to the Jews when they return to Jerusalem. Um, this might not be true, might not, it might be true, but at least they recognize it as that, at least within its context. It's because at the time, the freedom and religious freedom and tolerance that was afforded to people was major for the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, when we look back, you'll look back and say, no, that wasn't really religious tolerance. But at least for the time, it was a big step. So I'm going to ask the question. It's kind of a trick question, but what was Cyrus? Was he a Mede or was he a Persian? And it's a trick question because Cyrus's father was Cambyses the first. He was king of Anshan, who was a Persian. But Cyrus's mother, Dane, who was daughter of these names, Astyages, was a Mede. So Cyrus was half Persian, half Mede. And he is thought to have been the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. When he takes over Media, when he kills his grandfather, this guy, and now it's going to be one unified kingdom. So I'm comfortable associating the characteristics under Cyrus to the Medes as well, because he was both a Mede and a Persian. Um, anyway, so this freedom that's going to be afforded to the Jews and etc., it was pretty characteristic of how the Medes ran things. Zoroastrianism was a big part of the Median religion, and in Zoroastrianism, it was unlike many of the religions at the time, which emphasized predestination. Zoroastrianism taught this idea of free will with regards to choosing between good and evil. There's a significant degree of liberty and freedom in that, and not coercion. So the two characteristics are so far is decentralization and freedom, liberty. And the third one, before we close, and we'll close with application of this waymark, is the unchanging laws that is reflected in Daniel with regards to the Medes and the Persians. In Daniel 8, verse 6 and 8, in Daniel chapter 6, verse 8, sorry, we read about the decree that's passed under Darius, and it's said to be a decree that altereth not. In 12, it says the same thing. Verse 15, it says the same thing. So you have three characteristics: decentralization, freedom slash liberty, and unchanging laws. These are the three characteristics of Medes, essentially. So now coming to application of what I'm going to associate with this is that I've spoken at length in many presentations about the libertarian institutions that make up the USA, whether it's the decentralized nature of the United States. It's a federal system of government where power is divided between the central national government and the regional states, just like the satraps that Darius instituted, or the various expressions of libertarian principles with regards to freedom and liberty. If you read the First, Second, Fourth, 10th Amendment, it's all about this idea of freedom and liberty. And the key argument that the Supreme Court makes when defending these rights is based on originalism and legal formalism. So what is originalism? We've understood what originalism is. It's where you look at a text and you look at it in its original context and it stays fixed in time. So the Supreme Court's going to look at the Constitution and it stays fixed in time. Now, legal formalism is another philosophy where it says that laws should be applied exactly as they're written without considering external context. So legal formalism is the big umbrella, and under legal formalism, you have originalism. So when the Supreme Court decides its cases and you have Thomas Clarence standing up to overturn Roe v. Wade or past the various things that he does, it's from a libertarian argument based on legal formalism and originalism, looking back at where America was founded and the unchanging nature of the Constitution. So, what happened in 2014? Um, in 2014, the Supreme Court passed Burwell versus Hobby Lobby. And that's been covered in great detail. I think some of the teachers here have discussed that in detail in 2014. And when that decision was passed, the basis of it was about religious liberty. Um, that the Affordable Care Act can't violate religious beliefs of organizations, of corporations. And so when it passes this in 2014, I'm saying in the natural story, it's the Medes that come into an alliance with the Babylonians. So natural, is Medes plus Babylon. And the Medes I am representing as the different institutions in America that reflect this libertarian philosophy. And in this case, it's the Supreme Court, um, who go into an alliance with, at that time when Hobby Lobby was passed, you had your apostate Protestants, your evangelical churches cheering because they saw that as a victory for them, or the Republicans saw that as a victory for their beliefs in what the Constitution is or what America is. Um, so I'm not only tying the Medes to the Supreme Court, I'm just pointing out that it's the different institutions that reflect this libertarian philosophy, this decentralized nature of governance, um, because each satrap or each province should have the autonomy, the freedom to run themselves, um, the uh, religious liberty and freedom, as well as originalism and legalism. All that is the parallels that I'm making between the Medes and today the Supreme Court or the various other institutions that reflect this libertarian thought. Um, so we'll end there, and at some point in the future, at some other place, I'll continue on. But up until this point, now Babylon is in alliance with the Medes. Now there's an alliance that we have in 2014 between the dragon, I'm going to point that out, and the king of the north, the rising king of the north. Um, Aldates has often marked 2014 as a turning point in the culture war that's taking place in Assyria. And this culture war is against the establishment. So the establishment is Assyria. They are king of the north. So you have king of the north 1, but you have a rising king of the north 2, which is Babylon, who's going to take its place. And Babylon is going to go into alliance with the Medes to defeat the establishment. The next, um, the next significant battle or point of attack was Nineveh, and that was in 602. And it's in 602 that um, is spoken about at length by the various prophets. So I'll pick up there when I next am able to um, go over the study.
Did you say
So
602 for that one or 612?
612,
Oh, it is 612. Okay.
yeah. And that was Nineveh when Nineveh fell. Again, I said I used it's difficult finding the years, the correct years that you're going to use for these different battles. So um, I've where pioneers and Illinois have given a specific date, I use that date, and where there's gaps, I've just gone with the general consensus about when things have taken place. The reason why I do that and why I'm not consistently taking them from one place, you'll see when we start discussing the 70 years. The 70 years of Jeremiah don't fit if you use what the dates historians used. And just the one point where I can see why you need to be careful when using historians for dates is they don't even recognize Darius the Mede as king of Babylon when it does rise. Um, so yeah, we'll close for there. To recap, we've gone through um, the rise of Babylon and its rise starting with a revolution that's going to take place. I'm marking that at 2001. After the time of the end, where you have two kings and Jeremiah starting his ministry for 40 years. And the first major city to fall was Asher. There were different skirmishes that take place between 626 and 614, but Asher was the point where it was okay. Yeah, now Assyria is is in deep water. Um, and the next one is Nineveh, which I said we'll pick up at another point. Um, the key points marking 2014 is that there's an alliance between these two entities in this culture war. In other stories, we mark alliances in 2014. Um, those other stories talk about other alliances, but this story is talking about alliance with regards to the rise of the King of the North. And I spent quite a bit of detail talking about the Medes because they come into our story a bit later. And I just wanted to drum home the point of why I think the Medes, the application of the Medes, is the dragon, um, at least in this story. So we'll close with a word of prayer. And yeah, dear God, thank you for the opportunity to study history. We know that history can teach us a lot about current events. That's our primary mode of Bible study. It's going into history and comparing and contrasting it with our own. I pray that you may continue to guide us as a movement as we learn more about you. And through these political events, may we not get lost in the detail. May we remember that the key point of everything that we do is for changing character. I pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.